Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. I am Steve, and in this episode we will be looking at the kickers and the defenses in terms of the ever so important draft that will be coming up for many leagues. This is the second video in this series, which is based upon a series of articles that I wrote, which you can find up on the website. That is theffforge.com, link in the description. In essence, what we are trying to find out from the series, what the goal was, there's more than one, but it just boils down to figuring out nuggets and data-based information, value-based information that we can take from all of this analysis that I do and apply to the draft. That is the ultimate goal, is what is this draft relevant information that we can take about each position and apply that to how we draft strategy. I explained things in more detail in the quarterbacks video, and I will in future videos as well. Just to say, this video's format will be a little bit different than the other positional videos, since I will be covering two positions, going into some of the extraneous details, some of the descriptions of how I came to certain conclusions would make for an excessively long video. I already don't do short very well, so with that being said, let's just get moving here. Please don't forget to do the YouTubey things. You know exactly what they are. You know that they're very much helpful and appreciated. Let's get to the split screen here. Let's begin today's analysis with the kickers. We're going to just start right off with the draft day quick files, as this is the end results of a lot of work and analysis boiled down to some of the most important details, so we can kind of fly through other portions of this, even skip over some things that I go through in other positions. Starting here, we're going to look at tiers 1 and 2. So you can see that tier 1 has an expected amount of 3 kickers that will finish the year or qualify for being a tier 1 kicker by the end of the season in 2022. That's the expectation based on 2021 data. That's about 10% of the draft class if you were to just be picking at random. So, not the worst chances, I guess, in that sense. The average weekly finish of the tier 1 kickers is going to be between kicker 8 and 13, and that definitely checks out. If you check the EV chart for just even the best kicker, you can see a lot of weeks right there are the week 12 for a Matt Gay, a little more up and down for a Nick Folk, some more up weeks, and actually higher floor than Matt Gay technically, but just less consistent overall. Quite a few more weeks in those 6 3-point, 7-point games, fewer than 8. So just to let you know, I do look over these things to make sure that what the outcome is also visually is working. The average expected fantasy points that you can have in any given week for the top 3 kickers is going to be between 9 and 11 fantasy points. The nice thing is that in over one of 3 games, you can expect to have more than 11 fantasy points, less than 6 in about 1 of every 3 games. As far as the short-term replacement goes, there is a reason that I have a range, but up to 17% chance of just taking a guy who is getting a start in any given week for whatever reason, due to an injury, most likely. But there are a few teams who, struggle finding a kicker throughout a season. There is a decent percentage chance that they will end up giving you tier 1 kicker output. That's not the worst at a 1 in 5 shot, less than that, but in best case scenario. Also, probably not a 0% chance, at least in 2021, but I actually don't remember off the top of my head exactly why that range is what it is. I have a rough idea. Just looking at the positional advantage, the tier 1 kickers on a week-to-week basis, you can expect to be in a neutral game script with another kicker, or end up with +4 fantasy points. Not the biggest margin of victory, and along the season, when all is said and done, you can expect to have won your matchups by an average of 2 points a week, 32-ish, 34-ish fantasy points at the end of the year. And as far as draft day advice goes, you don't need to target the number one kicker off the board, but if you can get yourself one of those top 3 kickers, of course, end of season, but we're going by assuming that our rankings are good. If you can get one of those top 3 kickers, you're doing good, but you don't need to attack that number one kicker. I do want to point out, practically speaking, this season-long advantage here, I think, is more like a 1-point advantage, roughly, against the kickers that you're more likely to see. There are some kickers that we just know are bad, and they typically are bad in any given week. There's a few of those. We are going to look at Tier 2. There are roughly 15 kickers that are expected to qualify or finish within the second tier, meaning that there are roughly 18 viable starting kickers. Not much scarcity on draft day as far as finding a kicker, and even the value doesn't scream that you need to necessarily target this position too harshly. We know that. As far as the Tier 2 kickers, they have a pretty tight range. On average, they're going to end up with 14 to 17 points. Their kickers tend to score in that 7 to 9 point range in a lot of weeks. And these are the guys who are just kind of either ending up with that average due to some sort of inconsistency, or just due to the fact that that's what they're getting most weeks, a couple field goals, an extra point or 2. You're expecting to get this 7+ points. There is a reason it is a plus there, but you're expecting to get 7 points most weeks plus. And the interesting thing is that in as far as getting 11+ fantasy points like we looked at with Tier 1, you can expect that in under 1 of 3 games. So not a terribly big difference there as far as getting those bigger week helping games from a kicker. However, the Tier 2 quarterbacks do have this yucky floor where they score less than 6 points in roughly 43% of their games. That is 1 out of roughly every 2.5 games. So this, you kind of remember that. This will come back in part of my advice as how I view the position at the end of the day when we make some of these conclusions. If you'll remember that, it'll stick out what stands out to you. Weekly expectation, -1 to 3 points there for kickers. Not not terrible, more in the positive than not as far as what you can expect on a weekly basis. And the season long average, you once again just about 1 point. I would even if we want to knock that down similarly to how we did for Tier 1, practically speaking, you're just looking at a net neutral kind of guy on your team. Some weeks they're helping you, some weeks they're hurting you. At the end of the season, parsing out if they could have made a difference on your team, it's going to be hard. There, once again, might be weeks they helped you, other weeks that they hurt you at a pretty equal rate to one another. Once again, on draft day, you can lay back, but you do want to casually attack the position. There are reasons to get some of the better kickers, at least, compared to some of the worst kickers. Obviously, the better the kicker, the better the kicker. Not a surprise there. I will make a point to say, we're going to skip over the Tier 3 kickers, but that these Tier 3 kickers still have a 33% chance of getting you a starting quality game. That's not the worst, especially when you consider the fact that even the best kickers have a similar chance of not giving you a starting quality game. So keep that in mind when it comes to how this position operates. And we are going to move on down to Value Mountain real quick here. Recall that the tier 1 kickers are expected to finish kind of right in where I have highlighted, right in that 8 to 13, I think it was. And yeah, between kicker 8 to 13 in any given week on average. And so kind of right in that plateau. And that's part of the reason why you see there's no urgency to get the number 1 kicker in the league, because they're just not giving you any value compared to some of the next kickers. Now, this is a bit of a dangerous practice to go into, and I'll get a little bit more into that, I think, with the defenses. So just wanted to point that out, but in general, you get some increasing value throughout the position as far as weekly value goes. Going down, all the way to the expected ranges for the position on any given week. This is what you should expect the breakdown to look like at the end of the week when all the scores are tallied. The kicker number 1 on the week should most weeks finish between 15 and 18 fantasy points. And you can actually see right here, 10 weeks out of 17 weeks in the season in 2021, a kicker did finish within that range. 11 weeks for the kicker number 6 finishing with 11 or 12 points. Kickers don't have fractional fantasy points, so their outcomes tend to become fairly predictable. Even within these, even when you're just saying it's 1 or 2 points, most weeks there's not a whole lot of variety after you get past the first few quarterbacks. Kickers. See how many times I do that. Moving on down to the matrices that I have created, going into the scoring habits. A lot of this is seen in the quick files for the position. And what I just want you to visually see here is that the biggest advantage that the tier 1 kickers have lies not necessarily in that upside, but in hitting that floor less. And we'll call that floor from that kicker 18 spot on down. Just hitting those at a lesser rate. It's not a huge difference on either side, but when you combine those differences across the season, it does make a difference. I just want to point out that kind of what a conclusion that I came to for the position. And you can kind of read over this with me if you wish, right here. I like this sentence to kind of set this up. So we may not be able to predict the future. Of course we can't. But we are able to project what might happen. We are able to project what should happen. We are able to project what could happen. And we are able to project what we can expect to happen. With that in mind, if you get yourself a true tier 1 kicker, one of the top 3-ish kickers on the season, every week, these are the expectations that you would be able to carry. You can expect a 1-point advantage. You might expect a 3-point advantage or a 0-point advantage. You should expect a 2-point advantage, but anything could happen, but may not, for better or for worse. The position is pretty consistently inconsistent, I believe, is how I wrote it at one point in my analysis. Moving along to near the bottom here for the kickers. This chart 5 you can begin to look at. So in the end for the kickers, I was seeing signs that pointed towards a legitimate exclusive advantage provided from the tier 1 kickers. And as we have gone over here, I think I've pointed these things out more, is that I have also seen have here several other signs that indicate that you could not bank on a tier 1 kicker week in and week out, which led to this bonus bit of analysis that I have here, and where really I just wanted to compare the impacts of pure fantasy points scored versus consistency of the position on weekly head-to-head matchups, how those two different aspects of different type of kicker would impact their season long, their week to week successes. And what I did is I began by pitting Nick Folk, Justin Tucker, and Robbie Gould against each other. As you can see, those are our three best starting kickers from last season. Sorry, Robbie Gould is... So Nick Folk... I'm ahead of myself thinking about defenses. Nick Folk was a very inconsistent tier 1 kicker. Justin Tucker had an element of boom or bust in his game, but as you can see, more so relied on consistency, but it's like a wider range of consistency that he had from top to bottom, just not as boom or bust as Nick Folk. And then Robbie Gould was this guy who really didn't have a boom, but he was quite consistent in the games that he played, never going too low, like those 5s or 4s in there, but it's gonna happen for almost every kicker plenty of the time, and for a lot of them you're gonna see 3s, 2s, 1s, 0s, some negative point games in there as you get a little bit lower, but even some like a Greg Zerloin. So that was the analysis. We got ourselves a Nick Folk, a very highly inconsistent player, Justin Tucker, a little bit in between, an element of boom or bust to his game, but also fairly consistent, and then Robbie Gould, really no boom or bust to his game, but quite consistent. And we pit them together, pit them against one another, and what do we find out? Well, we see here that Nick Folk against both Justin Tucker and Robbie Gould in each head-to-head matchup ends up losing one more game than he won. So against Robbie Gould, 5 wins, 6 losses. Against Justin Tucker, 7 wins, 8 losses. This is our boom or bust example, and he's struggling out of the gate here against the bottom and top of the tier 2 type kickers, against more consistent kickers. Looking at how Justin Tucker did, he and Robbie Gould actually split their games, went 6-6, and then of course Justin Tucker had a +1 game advantage over Folk. Same thing would go for Gould. And as you remember from this, look how much farther down the chart Robbie Gould is there, and on a head-to-head basis, you're winning more weeks than not in that matchup. I also ended up adding Ryan Suckup and Cairo Santos. Those are 2 players who relied on consistency, however, are at like the top and middle of the 3rd tier. Cairo Santos right there, Ryan Suckup right there. I want to point out one thing here. These are older charts, so you see this PCS rank. That is the EV ranking. Nick Folk at number 2 of the starters. These guys got eliminated from any of that data. If you went over some of that in the quarterback analysis, but any players who play 5 or less games were eliminated from data sets at a certain point within this data, within this analysis. And then the consistency ranks right here are my consistency ranks, and that is the shift from the top 24 to the top 12 ranking that you're seeing there. There is some analysis, I think, somewhere else, not really truly perfectly relevant for what I'm about to go over. So as we will see for the consistency of Robbie Gould, it allows him to punch up at pretty much a neutral season-long outlook, but against, one of the best, Nick Folk, he actually outbeat him. So it really... that consistency helps along the bottom of that tier 2. It's a predictor of success to a certain point. And Nick Folk a guy who relied on the boom or bust, absolutely crushes it once we get down to these tier 3 guys. Even the back end streamers slash high end back end starters slash high end streamer type guys, he crushes it immediately as we get into that group, as you can see against Ryan Suck up there, compared to how Tucker and Gold did against some of those higher end tier 3 guys. However, he did struggle versus the tier 2 guys. And as far as Tucker goes, our hybrid kind of guy, he was it's right here. He outdoes the tier 1. He's pretty much on par with Robbie Gold. However, versus these streamer type guys, Robbie Gold did have a little bit of a smaller sample size last year, unfortunate, but he was the type of guy I wanted to look at for this specific analysis. And then we'll see Justin Tucker actually outperforms Nick Folk versus some of the worst of the position, guys that you're definitely less likely to see, but I wouldn't quite say you'll never see. There's Jason Myers, Cairo Santos are actually probably the only two in that group, so you're just not likely to see those guys anyways. So there's Nick Folk's advantage against guys that you're likely to see. So as you can see, the tier 1 talent doesn't give you an expected weekly advantage versus the tier 2 talent, the most likely guys that you will be coming against. However, they do offer a certain advantage against streamers, guys that I would guesstimate 2 to 4 of the teams in your league may be using outside of weeks when your opponent's starter has a bye week, that week that you happen to be facing them. So looking at the tier 2 guys, the high-end guys will offer some of, but less of an advantage than what you found with those tier 1 players. However, they won't give you an advantage versus the high-end streamers, those guys that you are more likely to see, as I just went over. So that is where the boom or bust helps you compared to consistency. Consistency will help you punch up, but not down necessarily at the kicker position. The high-end streamers, the low-end starters, those guys basically give you a neutral game script on a weekly basis against the majority of your league. I mean, you look at Robbie Gold here. You look at how Tucker did, the 4th best kicker, compared to the 21st best kicker, and Tucker only had a 1-game advantage. So you can see how broad, how wide the talent pool is for the kickers. Now I'm going to shift gears and cover the DSTs in a similar, hopefully brief manner, and then I will finish up the video with the overall draft advice / profiles of each of the positions in the conclusion of this video. And it is getting hot in here, so I am glad I already recorded that prior to going to the split screen here. Looking at the DSTs, looking at tier 1. Whoa, oh my gosh, look at that. 26 DSTs are expected to qualify or finish the season as a tier 1. Almost all of them are expected to be in this one massive tier that I have here. I will provide an argument against this tier later on. However, obviously I have it here in stone for a reason. So there are arguments that can go both ways a little bit with this DST, and ultimately my advice kind of sides with both arguments in the end, and it's workable advice to take into the draft with you. There is a valid reason for this massive tier 1. But there is a small group of defenses that give you an advantage within the tier. So basically against your competition, there were 3 of them in 2021. The only issue is that it's not a reliable advantage on a week in and week out basis. You can't rely on it. So Let's look at the tier 1 guys. On average, they're finishing between the DST 11 to the DST 18. A broader range than we saw with the kickers, but also a huge amount of DSTs that are averaging in that range. You can expect an average of 5+ fantasy points in every given week, and 0 in less than approximately 1 game. And you can expect 15+ points in 2 or 3 games across the entirety of the season, those boom games. Now you're thinking, that sounds nuts. That doesn't sound right. Well, let's look at our equalized value chart where we see these boom weeks. Let's look at Dallas, the number 1 team by really any measure. They have boom weeks, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks with 15+ points, 16 or 17 in 2 of those 5 weeks. Weeks with 5 or less points, even for the best kicker. 1, 2, 3. Another 4 weeks there with 5 points or less. And then you can average some of those out with some of these weeks, and you'll understand how that works out. 0 points and less in approximately 1 game. That's where some of these best players are going to give you that advantage. But even New England, definitely a star defense last season, gave you a -1 game, a -1 point game in 1 week. So I know that, believe me, even when I created these, I was the defenses took me a while to come to terms with and settle on things. It was a tough one. As far as short-term replacement goes, defenses can't get hurt. Individuals can, but with 4 out of 5 defenses being viable starters based on this data, even if I were to break apart one tier from this or another, you're still getting roughly similar results across a lot of the position. Doesn't matter. So as far as weekly expectations go, once again, going to be a pretty big range here with -4 points to 6 fantasy points. It's a very boom or bust position, and the season-long average that you would expect for any DST at random really is a slight advantage, but not by much. Should you attack the position on draft day, or should you lay back? By the book here, we're going to lay back on the position. We're not going to attack it. I do have some other advice, though, in regards to those top-ish defenses that you can look for. Tier 2, you can see some of those differences there. No reason to cover them. We do a pretty good job of figuring who they are out pre-draft as far as just the bad defenses. And throughout the season, it's very rare that they're going to get any kind of recommendation to be started. They're pretty just well known as these are the defenses you don't touch. And there's about, how many of those? 6 of those. That sounds about right. So moving on to Value Mountain. There are not a lot of notable changes in value here. If you look at the percentages, it's some pretty small slides. Same with the kicker was similar like that. Until you're getting into those bad defenses. But what this really means is that each week there are somewhere between 12 to 18 defenses that are putting up similar enough points. If you combine that with the fact that the best defenses are going to average being a back-end DST, considering looking at this valley here, then it becomes hard to recommend prioritizing the position at all. The best defenses are coming right in this valley that, 11 to 18 range. That's where they start, is right in the heart of that valley. Valley. So it's a tough position to recommend prioritizing because everything is so inconsistent and the value is just really never there at the position. Admittedly, using this as a theoretical leap to take this single week type data and apply it to our season long analysis is risky. It's you could ignore it if you wish to. However, when we can back that up with other information along the way, then we can believe that that might mean something. And I think it does for this position. Let's see how well that holds true or not. Obviously, DSTs cannot get injured, so ignore that. And move right on to the expected ranges about page 15. Here, once again, just doing a quick pit stop to look at the DST1 of any given week. You can expect them to have scored between 19 to 23 points. For the DST6, you would expect them to score between 10 and 13 points. And for the DST12, you can expect them to score 6 to 8 points in any given week. I am going to just quick flash the kickers' expected ranges to compare that to, as I will go over that in the end analysis, but just so you can maybe catch something on your own, there's the kickers, top 12, top 18 there, and the defense, top 12, top 18, kickers, defense, darn it, kickers, defense. There's something interesting that happens with both positions. So let's keep moving on to matrix 1.1. The first matrix here, because we are going to just ignore matrix 1.2. I believe I wrote that in here. It is not incredibly relevant given this huge first tier. So let's look at that first tier broken down a little bit more. And just here's where the argument will begin for those doubters of my first tier results, of that huge number one tier. Here's going to be me giving you something else to chew on rather than just that big tier. And the argument is really more so for the removal of the DST 18s, the guys who averaged DST 18 across the season, compared to maybe bumping up the DST12 into their own grouping. There could be an argument either way, really and truly, but I believe there is some of that top talent anyway, so we don't need to remove them. Thinking about those DST18s and removing them, just looking visually here, I think you can see the clear differences between like those at the DST6 numbers and how often they score within those ranges, as well as looking at the bottom, looking at when they score as the DST 30 or worse in any given week at more than a double rate of the DST 15s, and obviously much higher than the DST 12s. Looking at matrix 1.2, moving to 2.2, because I jumped the gun on letting you know to ignore 1.2. Jumping to 2.2, here's this negative 5%. We came into that, I think, with the quarterbacks. Sometimes, depending on what I think the reason is for this kind of middle column not being 0% all the way across, depending on what the reasons are for that, or at least the suspected reasons are for that, I am more or less conflicted on how to treat that. Because when pitting a tier up against itself, on one hand, I am predicting into the future here. So I'm in essence expecting that that tier is going to self-correct when it faces itself with another season's worth of data. I'm kind of thinking that things didn't perform to what you would expect every season as far as individuals that made up those numbers within the tiers. On the other hand, it can, and it does, really mean that I created a lopsided tier. How can I argue against that? It's lopsided. So, like I said, there can be many reasons for why it might end up being lopsided, but in the argument that the first tier should not have those DST 18s in it, or the DST 12s should be off on their own as a top tier. Here is concrete evidence to say that you are not necessarily wrong in saying so based on the outcomes of 2021 data. If we go by the other hand, however, the first hand that I brought up, looking into the future, the position is at a net negative of about 1 point in 1 out of every 2 games, if that data is correct. And there's other things that I looked at that I believe say that, it's tough to expect in every 2 games for a defense to be winning both of those games for you in head-to-head matchups against anybody that you would expect to be seeing. So there are defenses that are that you will expect good things from across the season. There is no doubt about that. I think that we all know how good it feels to have a reliable defense season long, just based on feel, without any kinds of numbers involved. But my argument mostly goes for how you should approach the draft. And I believe that on draft day, you should expect that any defense that you take will give you a net negative of 1 fantasy point over the span of every 2 games played on average. Now, we like to back things up with data. We can't just throw things out there and say, well, that's probably true. So right down here is an bonus information that I looked at. I looked at these 3, and I think a different example as well. But what I wanted to look at here is, what I looked at prior to here would be consistency. So let's look at the topic of consistency for the DST position. We learned for the quarterbacks that consistency is definitely a predictor of success for that position. We saw for the kickers just previously that consistency was an equalizer, but that ultimately the boom portion in a boom or bust type of player won out against the position as a whole. And for defenses, consistency does not provide a benefit to the position, is not a key predictor for success. In this example, I looked at the top 3 defenses from my EV analysis from the 2021 season to help show the validity of the statement that consistency is not something you want to aim for on draft day for defenses. It's not something that predicts success. It's not good anywhere across the position, truly. But that is the short of what that analysis comes to. And in large part, once again, this is the results of that analysis that you can look at. In large part, this turns out to be true due to the 100% overlap at the position from the best to the worst players as far as potential output goes in any given week, as far as the weekly potential output goes. As far as defenses go, boom weeks are ultimately what makes a good fantasy defense good. It's not getting you those 7-8 points like a kicker can do to at least help equalize itself amongst the position. It's the boom. You want the boom when it comes to defense. Lay down the boom. All right, we shouldn't be needing to look at the paper anymore, so we're back to my full face. There are some conclusions that I came to on how to treat these 2 positions, and let's start with what is fresh in our brains, the DSTs. Given the fact that the industry stinks at predicting what defenses will be good each year, it's a gamble when you draft a defense. But there are going to be a few that legitimately can help your team on a season-long scale. Thus, it is worth targeting a few defenses in the draft, but under no circumstances are they going to be worth reaching for. Of the top 3 defenses last season, Indianapolis, New England, and Dallas, Indianapolis and New England had averaged ADPs of 8 and 10, but definitely were not drafted in all leagues, with ADPs of 16 and 18 on the higher end of their ADP range that I found. The single best DST of 2021, according to my EV charts at least, Dallas, had an ADP of 18, aka undrafted in most leagues. Ultimately, my suggestion is to plan on streaming the position. Have a defense or three that is not going to be projected to be drafted in most leagues, or are going to be expected to be taken on the later end, like those Indianapolises and New Englands of 2021. Have them prepped. Preferably have ones prepped that have a couple of good matchups over the first few weeks of the season, and then grab one of them. In the event that you feel that you've drafted a highly volatile team, if you have several starters with inconsistent past profiles, I think that is the scenario in which you are most warranted. You have the most of my support in attempting to go and get a stud DST off of the board. So have a couple of DSTs that you will grab if or when the value is there, which we'll find out roughly, kind of where that is along in the draft when we combine all the information from each of the positions all together in one big value chart, kind of. But otherwise, go with one of those backup streaming options that I told you to come prepped with for the draft if you have to draft a defense. If your league does not require you to draft a defense, probably don't do that. And I would even suggest that in the event that you have to draft a defense, pull a little tomfoolery out and don't grab your target defense. Instead, let them go undrafted. Don't let anybody know that you have interest in them. And immediately after the draft, drop whatever defense that you picked up and pick up a valuable backup running back in case some sort of injury happens between the time that, it doesn't have to be a running back, but you get the idea. In case a big time injury were to happen, that might skyrocket a player's value in the meantime between draft day and week one. A couple days before, after the final practice of week one's games, so can't remember if that's usually on Thursday, but like Friday or Saturday, then you can go ahead and pick up that target defense, maybe pick it up a day or two, earlier. Don't wait till game day, just in case somebody else is doing something similar and happens to like the same defense. An interesting tidbit that I found on the position about indicators of success for the DSTs is that between looking at Dallas, Indianapolis, and New England, they were all in the bottom half of the league in sacks per game, 16th, 21st, and 25th. Two of the three were near the bottom of the league in fumbles recovered. So 28th and 29th for those two teams, and Indianapolis was not in the bottom. They were fourth. All three, however, were the top three for interceptions. All three were in the top of the league in turnover margin, blitz percentage, quarterback hurry percentage, quarterback knockdown percentage, and quarterback pressure percentage. Each showed no observed correlation between what those values were and the fact that these teams were in the top for interceptions and turnover margin. So those are not good indicators. You would think they would be, but they're not necessarily going to be indicators that you can bank on to tell you whether a defense is going to have those kinds of plays, the big interception plays, preferably, and I think necessarily for a good defensive week, to turn into 6-point INTs, to turn into defensive touchdowns, and those turnover margins, those aren't good indicators. So when people are spouting off, oh, this defense had a hurry rate of such and such a percentage, so they're going to be a good defense, it doesn't correlate that way. Ultimately, You want an offense that does not turn the ball over and a defense that does, because those 6-point touchdowns are what makes the boom weeks at a position where the boom weeks are what makes the best DSTs stand out. It's what makes them the best DSTs. Don't take a defense on a team with a quarterback who is going to set the offense up with good field position, the other offense up with good field position, because it will bite you in the butt. Those are the types of things that just make an average week for your DST. Few field goals here and there and a touchdown, and all hope is lost. Now, turning our attention to the kickers. Once again, the boom is what you are looking for at this position. Weekly advantages don't really exist, and once again, the industry is not the greatest at projecting kickers in the pre-draft, in the off-season, before your draft. So don't reach on draft day, but depending on how your league drafts, strike when you get the chance. The kickers don't provide the biggest ceiling and floor, so they provide the lowest one as far as the ceiling goes. I like to think of Tier 1 kickers as teams' lucky charms, fantasy squads' lucky charms. They might offer you a much needed boost to win the week. And to the exact opposite of my advice for the DSTs, I would recommend that if you find yourself drafting a highly consistent team, that lucky charm would be the handiest on that type of squad. The reason being that the reason for this kind of going to the opposite of how the DSTs works is because a kicker's boom probably is not going to be enough to help overcome some of your studs having down weeks. If your team is reliant on those studs not having down weeks, they're just not going to be able to make up for that difference most weeks. However, it is more likely for a consistent team that it will help those types of teams to just get over the hump on a week where you're in a tight matchup, and that 13 points from your kicker compared to the 7 points from the other team's kicker is what gets you the win. In regards to for what to look for on draft day, find a kicker that is on a team with a staunch defense. That is going to be a better predictor of good kicker play than an explosive offense is. Of course, the offense needs to be able to move the ball as well. They cannot be a completely useless offense. That's just not going to work out most weeks. But you will see more success if the team's defense can put the team in a good field position more regularly, and or a defense that limits the other offense so much that the kicker's team is going to be more likely to settle for a field goal. As analytics-based decision-making becomes more and more popular in the NFL, as it is on the rise right now, I expect for this type of advice to be more true than ever. Teams really are settling less and less for field goals and going for those touchdown opportunities when it presents themselves. So if a coach feels that they can rely on their defense, that they don't think that they need that statistical advantage of getting a touchdown on every drive, then they're more likely to settle for the field goal. The big question is to stream or not to stream. And surprisingly, I came to the conclusion of no. You should not be planning on streaming. Do what you can to lock in one of the top few kickers. They don't grow on trees, nor can you rely on matchups to help determine success in season. They are just too inconsistent, and they're very consistently inconsistent. Avoid flip-flopping early on in the season. Stick with the guy that you get. And when I say that, I don't mean, blindly just stick with whoever you drafted. But for the most part, give them an opportunity to succeed. It's out of 3 weeks is kind of my window of giving them the window of opportunity to succeed. And that is based on a lot of the math that I was looking at overall for these for this position. But worst case scenario, over a 3 week span, you should really only find yourself in a net 1 point hole. So that's why if you sit there and you get 2 bad weeks out of a kicker and then you switch over to some kicker, you're kind of ruining your giving a chance for the odds to go in the wrong direction for you. Whereas if you just stick with that guy, all of a sudden you might get that boom week, at least in that 3rd week, and it should help offset maybe a couple of poor weeks, just how the position works out. So I think that it is worth sticking it out for a couple of bad games to ensure that you and or the experts were incorrect on a guy. That being said, once again, don't blindly do this. If a clear opportunity comes along the way, somebody drops a guy that you liked more pre-draft, and your current kicker hasn't done too well, I mean, hop ship. But just beware that you could regret it down the line, and generally if you're just sitting there and jumping every single week. If you do decide to go into the draft with the mindset of streaming the position, what you are looking for is going to be a kicker who will be facing a team that turns the ball over a lot. Quarterback who throws a lot of picks is going to be good to look for to pick the opposing kicker, or a team that we suspect will be struggling on offense to a certain extent. That is a good thing to look for, but of course, you want that team to have a decent defense. That would be preferable. So get a not great offense, but functional offense with a at least solid defense if you can find that, or if you can find them opposing a team who turns the ball over a lot. Those are the types of kickers that you're going to be wanting to grab on a week in and week out basis. Weigh those things however you may. To sum things up, the main difference between kickers and defenses is that kickers provide a season-long advantage, just not a weekly advantage, while defenses provide weekly advantages, but the season-long advantage isn't quite there. It's so close to being there, and there are definitely a few that you'll feel good about owning, but that's regardless of this overall strategy of value that we're looking at in these examples. So defenses do have that higher ceiling, but already by the 6th player on any given week, the kickers actually have the higher floor. So by the 6th kicker in any given week compared to the 6th defense in any given week, the floors are already higher for the kickers. And by the 12th player, kickers' floors are equal to the DST's ceilings. So defenses tend to have a steeper slope down right from the top, even though they do have a higher ceiling, which is obviously an attractive feature of the DSTs. The value of a kicker holds for longer, and it makes them less scarce than the DSTs. So, all in all, continue to be thinking that DSTs are more valuable, but it is not value that you can put up for collateral either. From a pure value perspective, you should probably be looking at the kickers once the top few DSTs have been taken off the board, but we'll look closer at that when we combine all of this information into one. And of course, we know that the industry isn't the best at predicting this type of thing, so if you feel strongly about players and they're still on the board, of course, you go for who you feel the best about taking in the end. That's trust your gut type of thing. Is even when it fails, it just feels better to be failing from something that you decided compared to failing from some piece of advice that you heard online or just following the ranking strictly, because then you're thinking, oh, what if I would have gone with so and so that I liked? I really liked them and I chose him over them. It feels worse than just choosing the guy you like and them failing, in my opinion. So Thank you so much for supporting and the channel and tuning in again. I will have the tight end position video coming up next. Links to the website and the Patreon page are in the description below. If monetary support isn't something that you can do, just tell a friend about the channel. Like, share, subscribe, comment. You know, it all helps. It truly does, and it is all a level of support that I can't thank you enough for. So until the next video, which I will be a little less, a little more prepared for, have to look at the notes list. It's been a lot getting all of these things done for these videos, along with other things in life. So, Steve out.